The dust had not yet settled from the last rider's horse when Edna Shelton pressed her back against the sun-bleached post of the Caldwell General Store and made herself as small and invisible as a woman of her particular circumstance could manage. She had counted them. 14 cowboys riding through the main thoroughfare of Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing September heat of 1878, and not a single one of them had so much as slowed his horse. Not one had looked twice at the woman standing there with her single carpet bag, her cracked leather boots, and the desperation she could not quite manage to hide behind her proud, square shoulders. 14 men. 14 times the hot shame of being unseen had crashed through her chest like a fist, because being unseen in Caldwell on this particular afternoon was not merely a social embarrassment. It was a death sentence. She had exactly 48 cents in the pocket of her calico dress. She had no family within 500 miles. She had a letter of introduction to a man named Gerald Pratt, who had written to her 3 months ago proposing marriage through the mediation of a correspondence agency in St. Louis. And she had ridden a train and then a stagecoach, and then the last 12 miles in the back of a stranger's hay wagon to get here. Gerald Pratt, she had discovered 30 minutes ago, was dead, shot in a card game 3 weeks prior. Nobody had thought to send word, so there she stood, 24 years old, alone in a cattle town at the edge of the Kansas frontier, with the sun dropping toward the horizon and the knowledge sitting in her stomach like a cold stone that she had no place to sleep tonight, no food beyond the half-eaten biscuit in her bag, and no plan beyond not crying in public. The 15th cowboy came through at a canter, hat low, coat dark with trail dust, and Edna watched him with the blank, hollow look of a woman who had already given up on being noticed. He was tall in the saddle, lean through the shoulders, riding a dark bay horse with one white sock. He was going to pass her, just like all the others. She turned her face slightly so she would not have to watch, and then the hoofbeats changed. She heard the horse slow. She heard the creak of saddle leather and the soft sound of boots finding the ground. She made herself not look. She was not going to be the kind of woman who chased after every man who happened to stop his horse nearby. She had her dignity still, even if she had precious little else. "Pardon me," said a voice, low, unhurried, neither cruel nor kind yet, just the bare sound of a man choosing his words with some care. "I don't believe I've seen you in Caldwell before. What's your name?" Edna turned. He was looking directly at her, not past her, not through her, not at some point on the horizon behind her left ear the way men sometimes looked when they were speaking to women they did not really care to address. He was looking at her face with a directness that was almost startling, his hat held now in one hand, and his dark eyes steady and patient and waiting for her answer as though her answer actually mattered to him. She swallowed. She straightened her spine. And because she was Edna Shelton and her mother had raised her to state her name like it was something to be proud of, she said it plainly. "My name is Edna Shelton." He nodded once, slow and thoughtful, as if he was placing her name somewhere in his memory where he intended to keep it. "Roscoe Hadley," he said. "You look like you might be in some trouble, Miss Shelton." She wanted to tell him she was perfectly fine. The words were right there, polished and ready, the automatic reflex of a woman who had spent her whole life refusing to be a burden to anyone. But something in the honest way he was looking at her made the practiced lie feel impossibly heavy, and after a moment she let it go. "I believe I might be," she said, and that was how it began. 3 months earlier, Edna had been living in a narrow room above a laundry in St. Louis, Missouri, pressing other women's linens for 12 hours a day, and trying not to think about the fact that she was 23 years old and going nowhere. Her father had died of a fever 2 years before. Her mother had followed him 6 months after that, worn down by grief and poor nutrition and a winter that had not let up. Edna had no siblings. She had 2 cousins in Pennsylvania she had not seen since childhood, and a former schoolteacher named Mrs. Hartwell, who had slipped her a card for the Western Correspondence Agency on a gray Tuesday in March with the words, "You deserve a proper life, Edna, and there is no shame in building one." Edna had held that card for 3 weeks before she used it. The agency had matched her with Gerald Pratt of Caldwell, Kansas. Pratt's letter had been formal but warm enough. He described himself as a cattle rancher of moderate means, 40 years old, a widower with no children, looking for a capable and sensible woman to share a settled life on the frontier. He was not romantic. His letters read more like a business proposition than a courtship. But Edna had not been looking for poetry. She had been looking for solid ground, and Pratt had seemed to offer it. She had packed everything she owned into one carpetbag. She had sold the last pieces of her mother's china to cover the train fare. She had written a careful, measured reply accepting his proposal, and then she had traveled west with the quiet, braced determination of a woman walking toward the unknown, because the known had nothing left to offer her. Now Gerald Pratt was 3 weeks dead and buried in the Caldwell cemetery, and Edna was standing on a dusty street with 48 cents, and a cowboy named Roscoe Hadley who was looking at her like she was a problem he genuinely wanted to help solve. He was not what she would have called immediately remarkable in those first moments. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their days outside, with a jaw that needed shaving and a coat that had seen hard use. But there was something in his manner that was different from the men she had encountered in her journey west. A kind of careful attention, a deliberateness about the way he moved and spoke, as though he had learned early that careless words and careless actions cost more than they were worth. "What brought you to Caldwell?" he asked, and there was no prying in it, just honest curiosity. She told him, all of it. She was not sure why. She had not intended to tell a stranger on a dusty street about Gerald Pratt's death and her 48 cents, and the hollow feeling in her chest. But Roscoe Hadley listened the way very few people ever listened to her, with his full attention and his expression open and unjudging. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment the way a man is quiet when he is actually thinking about what he has heard rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "You have anywhere to stay tonight?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell runs a boarding house on the north end of town," he said. "Clean place, fair woman. She'll take you in for 50 cents a night, and if you tell her Roscoe Hadley sent you, she won't put you out before you've had a chance to find your footing." He paused. "I can float you the cost if you need it. No obligation attached." Edna looked at him carefully. She had been raised to be cautious of strange men offering charity on the frontier. She had heard enough stories on the train west to know that not every kindness was what it appeared, but there was no hidden motive she could detect in his face. No sharp edge behind the offer. He was simply standing there holding his hat, a tired man at the end of a long day making a practical offer to a woman who clearly needed practical help. "I'll accept the loan," she said carefully, "with the intention of repaying it." The corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "I figured you'd say something like that," he said. Mrs. Clara Caldwell's boarding house was exactly as described. Clean white curtains in the windows, a smell of baking bread coming from the kitchen, and a proprietress who was a solid, warm woman in her 50s with flour on her apron and a sharp eye that missed nothing. She took one look at Edna's situation, glanced once at Roscoe with an expression that seemed to contain an entire silent conversation, and then said briskly, "Well, come inside then. Supper's at 7. Roscoe did not stay for supper. He left Edna at the door with the dollar he had already pressed into her hand and tipped his hat and said he hoped things would look better in the morning. She watched him ride away down the street and felt something she could not quite name, something that sat between gratitude and the unwelcome beginning of hope. She ate Mrs. Caldwell's supper. She slept in a real bed for the first time in 4 days. And in the morning she woke with the fierce and practical intention of figuring out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was complicated. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town at the end of its first great boom, the place where the Longhorn drives from Texas came to meet the railheads, and it had all the wild, churning energy of a settlement that had grown too fast and not quite settled into what it was going to be. There were decent families here, churchgoers and merchants and ranchers with honest operations. There were also gamblers and confidence men, and the particular category of frontier speculator, who made his living by identifying what other people needed and charging them more than it was worth to get it. Within 24 hours of arriving in Caldwell, Edna had learned that the late Gerald Pratt's ranch had already been claimed by a man named Silas Drummond. Drummond was a land broker, heavyset and jovial in the insincere way of men who had learned that a smile was cheaper than an argument, and he had apparently moved on the Pratt property within days of Pratt's death, citing a note of debt Pratt had owed him. She had also learned from Mrs. Caldwell over morning coffee that the correspondence agency in St. Louis had known about Pratt's death for 2 weeks and had simply not informed her, likely because they had already taken their fee and no longer felt obligated. That particular piece of information landed with a bright, clean shock of anger that Edna found almost bracing. Betrayal had a way of clarifying things. She had been used carelessly by an agency that was supposed to have her interests at heart, and Gerald Pratt's death had removed the one handhold she had been reaching for. And the result was that she was here in Caldwell with no plan and no resources, and a new, cold fury that she intended to do something useful with. She spent the morning walking the town, taking its measure. There was a school with no teacher, she noticed. The building was there, a small wooden structure on the east side, but the door was padlocked, and a notice was tacked to it reading, "Schoolmaster sought. Inquire at the mayor's office." She stood in front of that padlocked door for a long moment, thinking. She had 3 years of formal schooling followed by 2 years of reading every book she could borrow or beg, and Mrs. Hartwell, her old teacher, had told her more than once that she had the kind of mind that ought to be teaching rather than pressing linens. She had dismissed it then as kindness. Now she looked at it as a lifeline. The mayor of Caldwell was a man named Horace Greer, a nervous, efficient little man with ink stains on his fingers, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the demands of governing a cattle town in expansion. He interviewed Edna in his small office with the distracted air of a man who was doing 5 things at once, asked her 3 questions about arithmetic and composition, and then leaned back and said that the position paid $30 a month with use of the teacherage attached to the school building, a one-room cabin that was small but adequate. It was not much, but it was a foothold. She accepted. She was standing outside the mayor's office with the signed letter of appointment in her hand, still slightly disbelieving her own luck, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You look like a woman who just solved a problem," said Roscoe Hadley. She turned to find him leaning against the rail post across the narrow street, arms folded, watching her with that same patient attention she remembered from the day before. He had shaved, she noticed, and the coat was cleaner. "I believe I have," she said, and she told him about the school position. He listened, and the not-quite smile came back to his face more fully this time, something genuinely warm in it. "That fits," he said. "You don't know me well enough to say what fits," she pointed out, but without sharpness. "No," he agreed easily, "but I've got a decent sense about people, and you've got the look of someone who's good with words and better with sense." He paused. "Caldwell needs a teacher badly. The last 2 quit inside of a month. It's not an easy town." "I didn't come this far to look for easy," she said. Something in his expression shifted then, a small movement like a door opening just slightly, and he looked at her for a moment with a directness that was almost uncomfortably honest. "No," he said quietly, "I don't expect you did." She needed to ask him something, and she made herself ask it plainly. "What is it that you do, Mr. Hadley? Are you with a cattle operation?" He was quiet for a beat, and she got the impression there was something careful happening behind his eyes. "I work range for the Comstock outfit," he said. 14,000 acres southeast of town. I've been with them 3 years. "Is it good work?" "It's honest work," he said, "which in this territory counts for more than good." She thought about that as she walked back to the boarding house to collect her things. Honest work. It was such a plain way to describe a life, and yet she found she liked it. The men she had encountered in her journey west had mostly been the kind who described themselves in the largest terms possible, who built themselves up with words the way a shaky structure gets propped with boards. Roscoe Hadley had said honest work with no need to make it sound like more than it was. She moved into the teacherage that afternoon. It was, as advertised, small. One room with a sleeping area partitioned by a calico curtain, a wood stove, a rough table and chair, a narrow cot. There were spiders in the corners, and the window frame needed caulking, and the whole place smelled of neglect. She had it cleaned and functional within 2 hours, and when she stood back and looked at the small order she had made out of the chaos, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. School opened the following Monday. 16 children arrived, ranging from age 6 to 14, some clean and well-dressed and some in clothes that had seen hard use. They were curious and suspicious, and some of them were testing her from the very first minute in the way that children test people they do not yet trust. Edna Shelton had not grown up soft, and she recognized the tests for what they were, and met them with a combination of warmth and absolute firmness that seemed to startle the children into a kind of interested attention. By the end of the first week, she had order in the classroom. By the end of the second week, she had something more valuable, which was genuine interest from the children who had been waiting for someone to take them seriously. She saw Roscoe again on the Thursday of her first week, at the general store where she had gone to buy chalk and a new slate. He came in while she was at the counter, nodded to her with that quiet recognition, and bought tobacco and a length of rope with no more fuss than that. She expected him to leave without more than a nod. Instead, he waited by the door while she completed her purchase, and then walked out with her and said, without preamble, "How's the school going?" She told him, more honestly than she expected to. She told him about the children and the challenges and the particular stubbornness of a boy named Willis Greer, the mayor's son, who had decided that demonstrating his indifference to education was a form of social statement. Roscoe listened and then said, "Willis is trouble because nobody's expected anything of him since his mother died. Give him something to be responsible for. Give him the wood splitting for the schoolhouse stove and tell him the school depends on him for it." She looked at him. "That's surprisingly insightful," he shrugged. "I was Willis Greer at that age. Somebody gave me a job to do and it changed things." She wanted to ask more about that. About who he had been at that age and what had changed, and what the story was behind those careful, measured words. But he tipped his hat and said he had to get back to the Comstock operation and rode away, and she was left standing on the street with chalk in her hand, and the pleasant, unsettling feeling of a conversation that had ended before it was finished. She tried his suggestion with Willis Greer. She gave the boy the responsibility of the woodpile, framed it as a role of consequence, told him seriously that the classroom would get cold, and the children would suffer if he did not hold up his part. Willis had looked at her with suspicious dark eyes for a long moment, and then gone out and split the wood with a ferocity that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask something real of him. Roscoe Hadley had been right. She found herself thinking about that. She found herself thinking about him more than she strictly felt was sensible, which was mildly irritating to a woman who prided herself on keeping her thoughts organized and purposeful. He was a cowhand on a ranch southeast of town. He had been kind to her when she was in trouble. That was the whole of what she knew about him, and it was not particularly mysterious or remarkable. She told herself this firmly and then went on thinking about him anyway. He came back to town the following week, and the week after that. Each time, the encounters were brief and apparently accidental, but she began to suspect they were not entirely accidental on his part, and that suspicion created a warmth in her chest that she was not sure what to do with. They talked about the school, and about the town, and about Kansas in the autumn which was turning gold and fierce. They talked about books she had read, and whether there was any future in cattle ranching once the railroads kept pushing the routes further west. They talked about nothing important, and everything important in the way that people do when they are circling something they are not quite ready to name. One evening in early October, he asked if she would walk with him to see the sunset from the bluff north of town, and she said yes before she had time to think better of it. The bluff looked out over the flat, vast expanse of prairie, grass gone amber with the season, sky enormous above them in colors she could not have described adequately to anyone who had not seen the Kansas sunset for themselves. They stood side by side without speaking for several minutes, and the silence was the kind that comfortable people shared. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said at last. "You can ask," he said. "What is it that you're not telling me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought she might have gone too far, pushed too hard against whatever careful privacy he was maintaining. Then he let out a long breath and said, "I left Texas under a shadow." She waited. "There was a man I worked for, rancher named Beaumont, down near San Antonio. He had a foreman who was stealing from him, skimming from the cattle sales, been doing it for years. I found out and told Beaumont, and the foreman told Beaumont that I was the one stealing and that I'd been covering it by blaming him." He paused. "Beaumont believed the foreman. They'd known each other 20 years. I'd been there too. I was run off the property with a threat that if I showed my face in that county again, things would go worse for me." Edna looked at his profile against the sunset. "But you knew the truth." "Knowing the truth doesn't protect you from someone else's version of it," he said. "I came north, changed territory. Comstock gave me work on my record from before Beaumont, and I've built a decent reputation here over 3 years, but I carry it." He glanced at her. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think you deserve to know who you're spending time with." She thought about the word he had used, shadow. It was an honest word for what it was, the kind of darkness that followed a man not because he had done wrong but because he had been in the way of someone else's wrong. She knew something about shadows like that. Her father had lost his small hardware business when a partner had embezzled from the accounts, and the family had spent years in the shade of a reputation that was not theirs by right. "I believe you," she said simply. He turned to look at her fully then, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that she suspected he did not often allow. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that," she said. "I'm a fair judge of character, Mr. Hadley. I was taught to be." "Roscoe," he said. "Roscoe," she agreed. The ride back to town was quiet and easy, and when he left her at the door of the teacherage and tipped his hat and said good night, Edna stood in the doorway for a moment watching the darkness where he had ridden and acknowledged to herself that she was in serious trouble of a kind she had not anticipated when she had packed her carpetbag in St. Louis. She was falling in love with a cowhand who carried a shadow, and she had come to Kansas looking for solid ground, and she was not at all sure those two things could coexist. But the feeling was there, clear and warm and inconvenient, and she was too honest a woman to pretend otherwise. Roscoe Hadley rode back to the Comstock operation in the October dark and sat in the bunkhouse for a long time after the other hands were asleep, listening to the wind off the prairie and turning over the evening in his mind. He had told her about Texas. He had not told anyone about Texas in 3 years, not because he was ashamed of the truth of it, but because the telling required a kind of trust he had not found a reason to extend. He had extended it to Edna Shelton on a bluff above Caldwell, Kansas, with the sunset making the sky look like the inside of a fever dream, and she had said she believed him with a directness and simplicity that had hit him somewhere in the chest like a bell strike. He was 31 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade moving from one cattle operation to the next, never putting down roots deep enough to hurt when they were pulled up, because he had learned early that roots could be severed. He had known women in that time, the way men in cattle country knew women, briefly, and with a certain mutual understanding that nothing permanent was being built. None of them had looked at him the way Edna Shelton looked at him, with that frank, intelligent attention that seemed to see past the trail dust and the careful manner straight to whatever was underneath. He thought about the way she had stood in front of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house door the first day he had seen her. Spine straight, shoulders square, the exhaustion and the fear evident to anyone paying attention, but not stopping her from holding herself with that particular quiet dignity. He thought about the look on her face when she had told him about Gerald Pratt's death, the flat, contained way she had described it, and the fierce spark behind her eyes when she had described the correspondence agency's negligence. She had been furious, and she had converted it directly into action, found herself a position teaching school before he had even expected her to begin looking. She was the most impressive person he had met in years. And she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or arrangement, a strong-boned, clear-eyed beauty that came from being fully and unapologetically herself. He was in serious trouble. In November, the trouble arrived from a different direction entirely. A man rode into Caldwell on a gray Tuesday morning and began asking questions about Roscoe Hadley. His name was Coy Beaumont, and he was the younger son of the Texas rancher, 26 and angry in the way of young men who had been raised to believe that their family's word was the final word on all matters. He had been in Dodge City tracking a cattle deal, had heard Hadley's name from someone, and had ridden the 40 miles to Caldwell with the intention of making things difficult. Edna heard about it from Mrs. Caldwell, who had heard it from the barkeep at the Drover's Rest, who had been there when Coy Beaumont had announced his business to anyone who would listen. She closed the school an hour early, which she had never done before, and which caused 16 children to go home with a range of emotions from confused to delighted, and went looking for Roscoe. She found him at the livery, brushing down his bay horse after a morning's work, and he listened to what she told him with his jaw tight and his eyes going to something flat and careful. "I expected this eventually," he said, which was not a reassuring thing to say. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," he said. "There's nothing to do. Coy Beaumont can say what he wants. Truth doesn't change." "The truth doesn't protect you from someone else's version of it," she said quietly, throwing his own words back at him, and she saw him flinch. "That's what you told me, and you were right, so what do we do?" He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something complicated that had surprise in it and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude. "You said we," he noticed. "I said we," she confirmed. "Are you going to argue about the pronoun, or are we going to solve the problem?" His mouth moved in that almost smile, the one she had learned to look for. "You're something, Edna Shelton," he said quietly. "So people have informed me," she said. "Now think, who in this territory can speak to your character? Who has seen your work?" he thought. He named Frank Comstock, his current employer, who had 3 years of honest observation to draw on. He named the marshal, a man named Boone Delacroix, who had called on Roscoe twice to help track stolen cattle and knew his reliability. He named a cattle broker in town named Henderson who had conducted business with him directly. "Then we make sure those men are in the room when Coy Beaumont makes his accusations," Edna said. "We give the truth a structure. We give it witnesses." "He might not be making formal accusations," Roscoe said. "He might just be making noise." "Noise left unchallenged sounds like truth," she said. "I know something about that, too." He was quiet, looking at her with those steady dark eyes. Then he said, "You didn't have to come find me." "No," she agreed. "I wanted to." She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without decoration or apology, and let it sit between them and mean what it meant. She watched him absorb it, watched some particular tension in his shoulders change, watched something in his face become just slightly less guarded. "All right," he said. "We'll talk to Comstock." Frank Comstock was a big, plain-spoken man in his early 50s who had built his cattle operation from 40 acres and a borrowed bull, and who had a very low tolerance for other people's drama arriving on his land. He heard the situation from Roscoe with Edna present, and he was quiet for a moment looking at both of them. "You're telling me a Texas rancher's son has come to Caldwell to muddy your name over something that happened 3 years ago," Comstock said. "Yes, sir," Roscoe said. "And this is the schoolteacher helping you sort it?" "Yes, sir," Comstock looked at Edna with a considering expression. "Smart woman," he said. Then to Roscoe, "I'll speak for you. I've got no complaints in 3 years, and I'll say so to anyone who asks. You could have gotten away with 10 different kinds of dishonesty working this operation, and you never once tried." He leaned forward. "You should also know that I've had inquiries about buying this land from a speculator named Drummond who I told to go to hell. I mention it because Drummond seems to be sniffing around anything and anyone in this territory that might be made use of. If Beaumont is in Drummond's ear, that might explain the timing." Edna filed that name away. Silas Drummond again, the man who had seized Gerald Pratt's property. She was beginning to understand that Caldwell had a particular kind of darkness running through it, and that Drummond was near the center of it. Marshal Boone Delacroix was a rangy, deliberate man who wore his badge like a piece of working equipment rather than an ornament. He also confirmed that he would speak plainly about Roscoe's character, and he added, in the direct manner that was apparently habitual to him, "Drummond has been a problem in this town for 18 months, and I have not yet had enough to act on formally. If something is building, I'd be grateful to know what you two learn about it." They were standing outside the marshal's office in the thin November light, and Edna looked at Roscoe and Roscoe looked at Edna, and something passed between them that was understanding and partnership, and the beginning of something that was going to be very hard to put back in its box. Coy Beaumont spent 2 days in Caldwell making the kind of noise Edna had predicted, speaking freely in the saloon about Roscoe Hadley being a thief and a liar run out of Texas. And he found less purchase for the story than he expected, because Frank Comstock and Marshal Delacroix were both willing to say clearly and publicly that they had no truck with those claims. Henderson, the cattle broker, added his endorsement without being asked. The town had seen enough of Roscoe Hadley in 3 years to have formed its own opinions, and those opinions were largely in his favor. Coy Beaumont left on the 3rd morning, frustrated and empty-handed, and Roscoe Hadley's reputation emerged from the 3 days not just intact, but burnished, because there is nothing like a public defense to make a community declare where its loyalties lie. But Drummond was a thread that neither of them was willing to leave alone. Edna began paying attention in a methodical way, as she did everything. She listened in the general store and at church, and at the school where parents talked freely because they trusted a teacher. She noted what Drummond owned and what he was pursuing. She made friends with a woman named Agnes Prout, whose husband worked as a clerk in Drummond's land brokerage, and over Sunday dinners she pieced together a picture. Drummond was acquiring land through a combination of legitimate purchase and deeply illegitimate methods. The Pratt property had been seized through a debt note that several people suspected was forged, but no one had been able to prove it. There were 2 other ranches in the territory where similar situations had occurred. A man named McAllister had lost 40 acres under circumstances that smelled wrong. A widow named Frances Holt had signed over her homestead claim to Drummond under what she later said had been pressure she could not now substantiate. The trap Drummond was setting was elegant in its ugliness. He operated just at the edge of what could be legally challenged, and he chose victims who were isolated or vulnerable or both. Edna told Roscoe all of this on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November. Sitting across from him at the small table in the teacherage over coffee, she had made strong because they both needed to think clearly. He listened the way he always listened, completely and without interruption, and when she finished he sat for a moment with his coffee cup between his hands. "Drummond is going to move on Comstock eventually," he said. 14,000 acres. That's the biggest prize in the territory." "Then we need to move first," Edna said. "Move how?" She had an idea forming. It was audacious and somewhat frightening, and she was not entirely certain it would work. But she had spent a week thinking about it, and she had not found a better one. She laid it out for Roscoe in the careful, logical way she laid out problems for her students, step by step, and watched his expression go from interested to skeptical to something that looked like reluctant admiration. "You need to be willing to be part of it," she said. "It requires someone Drummond doesn't know and doesn't have a reason to be suspicious of." "And you think that's me?" he said. "I think that's me," she said. "And I'll need you close to ensure it doesn't go badly wrong." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the Kansas wind was doing its November work, finding every gap in the teacherage walls, and the stove was ticking with heat and the light was going early the way it did in that latitude as December approached. "I don't like you putting yourself in Drummond's way," he said finally, and his voice was quiet and direct and not quite managing to stay entirely neutral. "I know," she said, "but it's the right move, and I can handle it." "I know you can handle it," he said. "That's not the same as me being comfortable with it." She looked at him across the table, and the thing that had been building between them for 2 months was very present in the room. Not a comfortable, polite thing anymore, but something that had weight and urgency to it. She thought about what she was feeling, and she thought about the 100 practical reasons it was complicated, and she thought about the fact that she was sitting across from the one man in this territory who had stopped when every other man had passed by, who had asked her name, who had listened when she spoke and helped without being asked and told her his secret on a bluff at sunset. "Roscoe," she said carefully. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, quiet and resigned and also entirely honest, told her that he was having his own version of the same complicated calculation. She took a breath. "We'll get through Drummond first," she said, "and then we'll have that conversation." Something in his expression eased. "All right," he said. "Tell me the plan." The plan required Edna to present herself to Drummond as a woman who had received a small inheritance and was looking to invest in land in the territory. It required her to express particular interest in properties currently being held by his brokerage, ask specific questions about the nature of the debt instruments used to acquire them, and in the process, elicit enough detailed information about his methods to give Marshal Delacroix a formal basis for investigation. It was, in essence, a trap, and Drummond, who was accustomed to being the one setting traps, did not see it coming. She met with him in his office on a Thursday morning in late November, dressed in the best she had, with a fabricated letter of instruction from a fictional inheritance lawyer in St. Louis that she had composed and written out herself in her most formal hand. Drummond was exactly as she remembered him from Mrs. Caldwell's description, heavyset and jovial and false, his warmth a performance executed with professional smoothness. He talked too much. It was his weakness, the particular weakness of men who were brilliant and knew it, and could not resist demonstrating that brilliance to an audience. He explained his methods in terms that were slightly abstract but entirely damning. He explained the debt instrument approach. He mentioned the Pratt property in terms that made clear the debt note had been constructed after Pratt's death, rather than before it. He was not stupid enough to be explicit about the forgery, but he was vain enough to be implicit about his cleverness, and Edna listened and smiled and asked the kind of careful follow-up questions that drew him further out without making him defensive. When she left the office, she walked directly to the marshal's office, sat down across from Boone Delacroix, and told him everything she could remember verbatim, which was quite a lot because she had a very good memory. Delacroix listened with increasing attention, and by the end, he had the look of a man who has just been handed the key to a locked room he has been trying to open for a year and a half. He sent for the county land office records and a lawyer he trusted from the next town and began the formal process of investigation that same afternoon. Drummond was arrested 11 days later, in December, on charges that included fraudulent land acquisition and forgery of legal instruments. It would take the courts until the following spring to fully adjudicate the matter, but the arrest was made and the evidence was solid, and the properties he had wrongfully seized, including Gerald Pratt's former ranch, were flagged for legal review. On the evening after the arrest, Roscoe Hadley came to the teacherage door in the first snow of December, his hat and shoulders dusted white, and knocked. Edna opened the door and looked at him standing there in the snow and said, "Come in out of the cold." He came in. He took off his hat and held it. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "That conversation you mentioned." She felt the warmth move through her from her chest outward. "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about what I want my life to look like," he said. "And you're in it. You're very much in it. And I understand if that's too fast or too forward, or if you came to Kansas for solid ground and you're not certain I'm solid ground. But I needed to tell you because I think you deserve honesty from me always." "Roscoe," she said, and she moved toward him across the small room, and whatever she had been going to say next got set aside because he reached out and took her hand and held it in both of his, rough-palmed and warm, and looked at her with an expression that was completely without guard or distance for the first time. "You are the most remarkable person I've ever met," he said. "I said a good piece on that bluff, but I was not saying everything. I've been thinking about you since the first day I rode into town and saw you standing in front of that general store with your spine straight and your chin up and nothing in your hands to hold on to. I thought you were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." She thought she might cry, which was not like her at all. She blinked it back and held his hand more firmly and said, "I thought you were going to ride past like all the others." "I nearly did," he said, "and then something made me stop, and I am more grateful for that than I know how to say." She moved a step closer, and the warmth between them was immense and clear and entirely certain. "Then stop trying to say it," she said, and she rose on her toes and kissed him, and the Kansas winter howled outside the small cabin windows, and inside there was warmth and the profound, startling simplicity of two people who had found their way to each other through every possible obstacle and were not going to let go. They were engaged by Christmas. It was not a long courtship by the standards of the time, but Edna Shelton had never been a woman who needed an extended approach to a conclusion she was certain of, and Roscoe Hadley, who had been careful and measured about every other significant decision of his life, seemed to have arrived at his certainty with a completeness that required no further deliberation. He asked her properly, on Christmas Eve, in front of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, where they had come for the holiday dinner the proprietress threw every year for those in town without family nearby. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment. He went down on one knee in the snow in the light from Mrs. Caldwell's windows, which was either the most romantic thing Edna had ever seen or the most impractical, and she thought it was both, and she said yes before he had finished the second sentence of his proposal. The door of the boarding house opened and Mrs. Caldwell looked out at the two of them and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, get inside. You'll both freeze," and then immediately burst into tears of what was clearly great satisfaction. They were married in March of 1879 in the small Baptist church on the west side of Caldwell, on a morning that started cold and turned brilliant by the time they walked out the church door. Edna wore a dress she had spent 3 weeks making from ivory muslin with a pale blue ribbon at the waist. Roscoe wore a new coat and a clean shirt, and a tie he had clearly been wrestling with, and when he saw her coming down the aisle his expression went to something so open and unguarded that half the women in the congregation reached for their handkerchiefs. The ceremony was performed by the town's minister, Reverend Albright, who had known Roscoe for 3 years and Edna for 6 months, and seemed genuinely moved to be standing between them. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but when they were said between these two people they sounded new, because every promise was clearly meant with the full weight of two people who had learned the hard way that promises cost something, and were worth keeping precisely because they did. Afterward there was a celebration at the Caldwell Grange Hall that most of the town attended, with food contributed from a dozen households and fiddle music that lasted until midnight. Willis Greer, the mayor's formerly difficult son who had become one of Edna's most dedicated students, sat in the corner of the hall with a piece of apple cake and watched the new couple dance, and wore an expression of gruff, involuntary approval. Mrs. Caldwell cried twice more over the course of the evening and claimed it was the dust each time. Marshal Delacroix came and shook Roscoe's hand and told Edna without irony that she was the most useful civilian he had ever worked with, which she took as the compliment it was clearly intended to be. Frank Comstock came and drank 2 glasses of whiskey and said, in front of his wife and several witnesses, that he had been waiting for 3 years for Hadley to get his head together and was glad the man had finally managed it. They settled into the life of Caldwell together. Roscoe continued with the Comstock operation for the first year, riding range and managing cattle, but he had been thinking about his own land for a long time and the proceeds of the Drummond investigation, which had freed up a parcel of land adjacent to Comstock's property, gave them an opportunity. They purchased 80 acres in the summer of 1879 at a price that was fair because Marshal Delacroix had ensured the land title was clean and properly documented. 80 acres was not a cattle empire. It was a beginning. Roscoe spent the summer building, with help from Comstock's hands and 2 neighbors who came on successive weekends with tools and strong backs in the way that frontier communities built things when they built them right. The house went up in stages, a solid 2-room structure to start, with proper floors and a real window in the front room and a fireplace that drew cleanly. Edna did not give up the school. She had come to care about those 16 children, and about the ones who joined them as new families arrived in the territory, in a way that had become central to who she was in Caldwell. She negotiated with Mayor Greer to keep the position while also taking up the life of a rancher's wife, which required a creativity of scheduling that taxed even her considerable organizational ability. But she managed it, because she was Edna Shelton Hadley, and she had not come this far to stop managing things. In the autumn of 1879, Edna became pregnant. She told Roscoe on a Sunday evening when they were sitting together on the front step of their new house, watching the sun go down over the prairie in those immense colors, she had never stopped finding astonishing. And she told him with a mixture of joy and the honest uncertainty of a woman who had thought carefully about what parenthood in this territory meant. He was quiet for a moment, and then he put his arm around her and pulled her close and pressed his face into her hair and held her, and she could feel against her the particular quality of his happiness, which was the deep, still kind, the kind that does not make a lot of noise because it is too complete for noise. "We'll need to add on," he said at last, meaning the house, which made her laugh, which was perfectly characteristic of both of them. Their son was born in June of 1880, on a morning of early summer heat, delivered by the town's doctor, a competent man named Ferris, who had seen enough frontier births to be efficient and calm about it. Roscoe was outside the bedroom door for 6 of the worst hours of his life, by his own description, and when Ferris came out to tell him he had a healthy son, he stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe looking at the floor, and then composed himself and went in. Edna was exhausted and radiant in the way of women who have done something enormous and know it. The baby was red-faced and furious about the general situation, as newborns tended to be. "What do we call him?" Roscoe asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and looking at the small face with an expression of pure, undone wonder. "James," Edna said. She had decided this some time ago, after her father. "James Hadley," Roscoe said, trying it out, and something settled in his face, something that looked like being home. "That's a good name, Mrs." Caldwell, who had been there through the whole of the labor supporting Edna, with a competence that suggested she had done this before, looked through the bedroom doorway at the 3 of them and said nothing at all, but her expression was the most eloquent silence Edna had ever seen. The Drummond matter came to its full legal conclusion in the spring of 1880, just before James was born. Drummond was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of forgery, and sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary. Frances Holt's homestead was restored to her. The McAllister family received their 40 acres back. The Pratt Ranch, which had no clear air, was eventually purchased at auction by the Hadleys as their acreage expanded, giving them another 120 acres and bringing their total to 200, which was becoming, slowly and solidly, a real operation. In Texas, the situation with the Beaumont Ranch had also shifted. The foreman who had accused Roscoe, a man named Dillard, had run himself into legal difficulty of his own devising in 1879, and in the course of that difficulty, the truth about the cattle theft had come fully to light. Old Man Beaumont had written Roscoe a letter through the Caldwell marshal's office, a stiff, difficult letter that was not quite an apology, but was as close to one as a man of that particular pride could manage, acknowledging that the accusations had been false and that Hadley's reputation was clear. Roscoe read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in the desk drawer and sat for a while looking out the window. Edna, who had been reading on the other side of the room, looked up and watched him and waited. "It's done," he said at last. "Yes," she said. "I thought it would feel different," he said. "More finished, maybe." "You've been finished with it for a while," she said gently. "You just needed the paper to catch up." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the same open, unguarded look that had unmade her composure from the beginning, the one that he gave only to her, the one that was entirely itself with no performance behind it. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Know exactly the right thing to say." "I'm a teacher," she said. "It's professional habit." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, and then the top of James's head where the baby was asleep in her arms, and stood there for a moment with his hand on both of them. And Edna thought there were no words for what this moment was, and that was perfectly fine. James Hadley turned into a formidable 1-year-old, and then an even more formidable toddler, possessed of his mother's absolute determination and his father's patient watchfulness in an unusual combination that made him alternately the easiest and most exhausting child in the territory, depending on which quality was operating on a given day. He developed very strong opinions about horses very early, which given his parentage was more or less inevitable. The ranch grew. Roscoe hired a hand in 1881, a young man of 20 named Daniel who came from Arkansas with good references and a willingness to learn. And the two of them worked the expanded acreage through a summer of hard heat and a winter of driving cold, and came out the other side with a herd of 60 cattle and a reputation for honest dealing that was bringing them more business than they could always accommodate. Edna continued teaching until 1881, when Caldwell finally hired a second teacher to help manage the expanding enrollment, and she shifted to a role that was part-time and allowed her more time at the ranch without abandoning the school entirely. She was not entirely certain she would ever give it up fully. The school had been her first foothold in this territory, and it remained something that was entirely and solely hers in a way that mattered to her sense of herself. Roscoe understood this without needing it explained. In the late summer of 1881, Edna discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Roscoe at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in August, over coffee and biscuits, with James seated between them in his small chair making serious work of a piece of bread and butter. Roscoe looked up from his coffee cup when she said it, and his face went through 3 separate things in about 2 seconds before landing on a happiness so uncomplicated that it made her chest ache with affection. "We need to add on again," he said immediately. And she laughed so hard that James looked up at her in surprise and then laughed too without knowing why. Their daughter arrived in April of 1882. She was a large, loud, healthy baby with a very decided personality evident from her first hours of existence, and they named her Clara, after Mrs. Caldwell, which made that good woman so flustered and moved that she had to sit down in the kitchen and fan herself with her apron for several minutes. Clara Hadley grew up knowing that she was named for a woman of substance and seemed determined to live up to it from an early age. She was her brother's opposite in temperament, where James was watchful and deliberate. Clara was immediate and volcanic and absolutely sure of herself at all times. They were between them, everything their parents were. By 1883, the Hadley ranch had grown to 310 acres. By 1884, the herd numbered over 120 head. Roscoe's reputation in the cattle business of the Kansas Territory was solid and without shadow, a fact that he did not make much of, but that Edna knew mattered to him more than he would readily say. He was on the Cattlemen's Association now, a member with a voice and a vote, sitting at tables where deals were made and positions were taken, and doing it with the same measured honesty that had characterized him in everything she had known him to do. She thought sometimes about the 14 cowboys who had ridden through Caldwell on that September day in 1878 and passed her by. She did not hold it against them. People on the frontier were busy with their own survival, and a woman standing on a street was not their problem. She understood that, but she also knew that her life had turned on the fact that a 15th man had been different, had seen something worth stopping for, had asked a question, and then listened to the answer. She thought about it the most on the anniversary of her arrival in Caldwell, which she and Roscoe had quietly marked together since their first year. On the 4th anniversary, she walked with him in the September evening to the North Bluff, where they had watched the sunset together for the first time, back when everything between them had been beginning and uncertain and impossibly promising. She had left James and Clara in the care of Mrs. Caldwell for the evening, an arrangement Mrs. Caldwell embraced with the enthusiasm of a woman who considered those children a personal achievement. The prairie was still enormous below them, still amber in the turning season, the sky still doing that impossible thing with color. Edna stood beside her husband and felt the familiar expansion of the view, the way it pulled something in her chest open, the way it had from the very beginning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first time we stood here," she said. He nodded. He reached over and took her hand, and his grip was the same as it had always been, warm and solid and certain. "I was thinking," he said after a moment, "about the man I was before you, the man who moved from place to place and didn't put down roots. Keeping everything light so it wouldn't hurt to lose it." He paused. "I didn't know what I was being careful of losing. I didn't have anything worth keeping yet." She turned to look at him. He was looking out over the prairie, and the sunset was making the angles of his face sharp and warm and familiar in the way of things loved for a long time. "I came to Kansas looking for solid ground," she said, echoing herself from years ago. "Did you find it?" She looked at him. She looked out over the 310 acres that they had built together, thought about the house with the 2 children sleeping in it, and the herd and the school and the town they were part of, and Mrs. Caldwell, and the life that was entirely full and entirely real and entirely theirs. "I found something better than solid ground," she said. "I found someone to stand on it with." He turned to her, and the look on his face was everything it had ever been. All the versions she had learned to read over years of mornings at the breakfast table and evenings at the end of hard days, and the middle of the night with a crying child, and every quiet, ordinary, extraordinary moment of a life actually being lived. He kissed her there on the bluff above Caldwell, Kansas, in the September sunset of 1882, with the prairie wind in their hair, and the same enormous sky above them that had been there for every moment of the story that had brought them here. And Edna Shelton Hadley, who had arrived in this territory with 48 cents and a carpetbag and more courage than she had known she possessed, felt the deep, settled certainty of a woman who had found what she came for and more than she had thought to hope for. The walk back to town was easy and slow in the warm evening, and they did not hurry. There was time. There was, for the first time in both their lives, the sure knowledge that time was on their side, that tomorrow would come with more to build toward rather than more to run from. Roscoe held her hand and swung it slightly between them, a small, unconscious gesture of contentment that she had noticed he did when he was happy, and that she had never mentioned because she did not want to make him self-conscious about it. She loved him in the way that people love things they almost did not get, with a particular attentiveness to the fact of having them. She loved his steadiness and his honesty and his near smile that had gradually become a full smile over the years, a real unreserved smile that she had taken some personal pride in coaxing out of him. She loved that he listened, always, completely, and that he said what he meant and meant what he said. She loved that he had stopped his horse on a September street and asked her name as though her name was something worth knowing. It was such a small thing, such a simple act, and it had been the difference between everything and nothing. Back in town, Mrs. Caldwell was sitting on her porch with James on one side of her and Clara on the other, reading them something from a battered storybook. And when she looked up and saw the two of them coming down the street hand in hand, she nodded once with the deep, proprietary satisfaction of a woman who had been present at the very beginning of something and had known all along how it would turn out. "About time," she said, meaning they were back, meaning supper was ready, meaning all the rest of it too. James launched himself off the porch steps at his father with the absolute confidence of a child who has never doubted he will be caught, and Roscoe caught him and lifted him and settled him on his shoulders in a single easy movement, and Clara made her way more deliberately down the steps and arrived at Edna's side and took her hand in a small, firm grip. They went into Mrs. Caldwell's house for supper, the four of them, with the September evening cooling outside and the lamp light warm inside, and the smell of something wonderful coming from the kitchen. And the conversation over the table was the ordinary, indispensable conversation of a family. About the ranch and the school and what Willis Greer had said at the hardware store, and whether they would need to replace the fence line on the eastern pasture before winter, and what James had learned that day, and what Clara had decided she thought about it. And all of it, every ordinary word of it, was the thing that Edna Shelton had come to Kansas to find. She had found it in the man who had stopped when no one else stopped, who had asked her name and then stayed to learn the person behind the name, who had seen something worth seeing when 14 other men had looked through her. She had found it in the town and the school and the land and the children and the life that had grown from a single conversation on a dusty street. And she had found it most essentially in herself, in the woman she had always been, who had packed her life into a carpetbag and traveled west with her spine straight and her heart braced and her courage operating even when everything else had gone wrong. That woman had been here all along. She had just needed the ground to stand on, and a man who had the sense to stop and ask her name. The evening went long and warm, and the children fell asleep on Mrs. Caldwell's good sofa, exhausted by their evening's adventure, and Roscoe carried James and Edna carried Clara, and they walked home through the quiet Caldwell night under a sky full of cold Kansas stars, and the town was still around them, and the prairie beyond the town was vast and dark, and full of the particular silence that is not empty but full, the silence of a thing that has enough room to be what it is. At their door, Roscoe paused and looked up at the stars for a moment, and she stood beside him and looked up too. "What are you thinking?" she asked, as he had asked her on the bluff. "I'm thinking I'm lucky," he said. She looked at him in the starlight. "We're lucky," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the real one. "Yeah," he said, "we are." They went inside, into the warmth and the ordinary extraordinary life they had built from nothing but 48 cents and a stopped horse and a question asked, and the door closed behind them, and the Kansas night went on above the prairie, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and inside the lamp burned warm and long into the dark. Their family grew one more time, in 1885, when a second son arrived in October, born in the house Roscoe had built on their own land, with Dr. Ferris attending and Mrs. Caldwell present as she always was, and the two older children hovering at the door, with the particular mixture of excitement and uncertainty that older siblings bring to new siblings everywhere. They named him William, and he came into the world with the same lungs of fury as his sister and the same watchful dark eyes as his father, And when Roscoe held him for the first time in the October afternoon light, he stood at the window looking out over their land, their 310 acres of Kansas prairie, with his son in his arms and his daughter pulling at his coat and his firstborn James sitting serious and proud on the bed beside his mother. And he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Edna, who was exhausted and beautiful and entirely certain about everything in the way that she had always been when it mattered most, said, "For what specifically?" "For being the kind of woman who doesn't pass by an honest offer," he said. She looked at him across the room with the afternoon light between them and the sound of Caldwell life coming through the walls and the warmth of 3 children and everything they had made together filling the space around them. "You stopped your horse," she said. "That was the harder part." He shook his head. "No," he said. "Stopping was easy. You were standing there and I looked and something just knew." He turned from the window to face her fully, William tucked against his chest, James and Clara pressed close, the whole family in one room in the house they had built on their own land in the territory they had made their own. "The rest of it was just me trying to be worthy of what I'd found." And Edna Shelton Hadley, who had come to Kansas with nothing and built a life from courage and clear eyes and the chance meeting that had changed everything, looked at her husband and her children and the room they were all in together, and thought that some things do not need an answer, only the living of them. She had been passed by 14 times, and then the right man had stopped. And she had told him her name, and the whole world had followed from there. The years after that settled into the particular richness of a life that knows what it is. Roscoe Hadley became one of the most respected cattlemen in the Caldwell territory, not the biggest or the wealthiest, but the kind of man other men trusted with handshake agreements and asked for honest counsel, the kind of reputation that is built slowly and held for good reason. He bought no more land than he could work well, hired no more men than he could treat fairly, made no promises he could not keep. Edna Hadley continued teaching, part-time into the late 1880s, until Caldwell grew large enough that the school became fully managed by the new county school board. She was the first person they asked to sit on that board, and she served on it for 6 years with the same clarity and firmness that had managed Willis Greer's wood-splitting years before. Willis Greer himself, by then in his 20s, had become a surveyor who worked for the county, competent and steady, and he stopped by the Hadley ranch from time to time and sat at their table for supper, and pretended to have forgotten that Edna Shelton had once looked him in the eye and told him the school was counting on him. James Hadley grew up and took to the cattle business with a natural aptitude and a methodical intelligence that came from both parents. Clara grew up and became a doctor, or the nearest thing to it available to a woman in Kansas in the 1890s, training under Dr. Ferris, and eventually operating her own practice in the next county over, a fact that made Edna so proud she could barely speak about it without having to look at the ceiling for a moment. William, the youngest, turned out to be the reader of the family, the one who disappeared into books and came out with ideas, and he eventually left for a university back east with his mother's old carpetbag, which she gave him deliberately, and which he understood the significance of. Mrs. Caldwell lived to be 81 and remained the presiding spirit of her boarding house, and of anyone's business she considered worth presiding over, which was most of the town's. She was at the Hadley table for Christmas every year from 1878 until the year she died, and when she died, she was buried in the Caldwell Cemetery with a marker that James Hadley had carved himself, because she had taught him to whittle when he was 6 and he had never forgotten it. Marshal Boone Delacroix served the territory for 20 years and retired to a small farm 3 miles east of the Hadley land, and he and Roscoe played chess on Sunday evenings for years, never talking much, entirely comfortable in the way of men who have trusted each other in the field. Frank Comstock sold his operation in 1890 when his health began to falter, and he sold a portion of it to Roscoe at a price that was below market and was phrased in the deed of sale as fair consideration for 3 years of honest work never fully compensated. which was Comstock's way of saying thank you, and which Roscoe folded into the desk drawer beside the letter from Old Man Beaumont. The two documents he kept, because they were evidence not of his past trouble, but of the fact that truth eventually settled where it belonged. And on the Hadley land, in the house that had started as 2 rooms and expanded room by room as the family did, in the mornings when the Kansas light came through the windows and made everything clear and possible, and the cattle moved in the east pasture, and the smell of coffee was in the air, and everything was exactly where it should be. Roscoe Hadley and Edna Shelton Hadley lived out the whole of the life they had built from a September afternoon and a stopped horse, and a man who had decided that a woman standing alone on a dusty street was worth a moment's attention. It had cost him nothing to stop. It had cost him nothing to ask her name. And what it had given him in return was everything, the whole account of a life that had been headed nowhere in particular until it had found its direction, the woman who had made him certain, and the land that had made him whole, and the children who carried both their natures forward into a world that was still raw and open, and full of the particular possibility of a country making itself up as it went. He knew, in those mornings, that he had been lucky. He knew he had been wise to stop when something in him said to stop. He knew most of all that luck and wisdom meant nothing without her, without the woman who had straightened her spine and said her name like it was something to be proud of, who had turned a carpetbag and 48 cents and a correspondence agency's negligence into a school and a marriage and a ranch and a life of consequence. Every cowboy in the territory had passed her by. He had not. And the whole of his good life, every acre of it, every morning of it, every child of it, every honest year of it, was the answer to the question of why he had stopped. He had stopped because she was there. He had stopped because she was worth it. He had stopped because something in him had known, in the brief moment of looking at a woman standing alone in September light with her spine straight, and her eyes clear, and her courage operating at full power despite having no particular reason to be optimistic, that here was something not to be ridden past. Edna, for her part, thought about the 14 men who had passed her and did not feel the sting of it the way she once had. She had understood over the years that being unseen by the wrong people was not a reflection of her worth, but of their attention. That 14 pairs of eyes looking without seeing was simply 14 pairs of eyes not yet awake to what was in front of them. The 15th man had been awake, and he had asked her name, and she had told him. And that was the whole story and the beginning of every story after it, the single moment from which an entire life had unfolded in the deep, specific, irreplaceable way that only the right life unfolds, not perfectly, not without hardship, but truly, and with a fullness that left nothing essential out. The Kansas prairie went on around them, vast and enduring, the same prairie that had seen the whole of the frontier age come through it, and was quietly becoming something else as the century turned, something more settled and less raw but still carrying in its enormous geography the memory of what it had been. The grass still went amber in September. The sky still did its impossible things at sunset. The bluff north of town still looked out over the same wide distance. And on September evenings, when the light was right and the children were settled and the ranch was quiet, Roscoe and Edna Hadley sometimes walked to that bluff together, as they had since the first autumn of their acquaintance, and stood side by side in the old tradition, and watched the sun go down over the prairie they had made their own. They did not always talk. They did not need to. They had said the important things over years of mornings and evenings and the long, steady middle of a life built well, and what remained between them now was the comfortable, indispensable silence of two people who know each other completely and are glad of it. The sun went down. The stars came out. The prairie breathed in the dark. And they walked home together through the Caldwell night, through the town that had been their ground, toward the house that was their life, toward everything they had chosen and built and become. And behind them the bluff stood empty against the stars, still holding, as all places hold, the shape of the important moments that had happened there. The conversations, the confessions, the first time two people had stood side by side and known without yet saying it that this was the person, this was the life. This was the moment from which everything would be different. The door opened. The lamp was warm inside. The sound of their children in the house came out to meet them. They went in, and the door closed, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was complete.